If the United States actually invades Iran, the world will change faster than most people are prepared for. Not slowly, not in stages people can comfortably track on a map. It would begin with confusion, then shock, then panic, and then something much more dangerous. A chain reaction that spreads far beyond Iran itself. Oil would not simply rise. It could surge hard enough to shake governments. Shipping would not just slow. It could start breaking the assumptions behind global trade. And the war would not remain a clean military operation for very long, because history shows that once a regional power feels it is fighting for survival, it stops playing by peacetime logic. It reaches for every pressure point it has left. That is why the real danger is not just the invasion. The real danger is what the invasion unlocks next. Because once the first American boots go in, the United States may discover that entering Iran is the easy part. Getting out could become the real crisis. To understand why, we need to start with the current situation in simple terms. Reuters has reported that Washington has considered options that go beyond airstrikes, including securing tanker passage near the Strait of Hormuz, seizing Iran's Karg Island, and even sending forces to secure highly enriched uranium inside Iranian territory. At the same time, additional U.S. forces, including Marines and elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, have moved into the region, not as proof that a full invasion is certain, but as proof that military planners want the option. That distinction matters. Governments rarely announce an invasion before they make it. They build flexibility first. They create military choices. They move logistics, air power, naval cover, and rapid reaction forces into place. And once that infrastructure exists, the political barrier to using it gets lower, especially if leaders begin telling themselves that one limited operation can solve a bigger strategic problem. But what happens when a limited operation lands in a country built to make limits disappear? From a strategic perspective, Iran is not Iraq in 2003, and that difference is everything. Experts cited by Reuters argue that while the U.S. can severely damage Iran from the air, total defeat would require a land invasion involving up to 1 million troops operating in harsh terrain. That is an astonishing number, and it tells you what serious analysts think about the scale of the challenge. Iran is large, mountainous, politically hardened, and deeply shaped by decades of preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. It does not need to beat the United States in a direct conventional war to create disaster. It only needs to survive long enough, retaliate widely enough, and raise the cost high enough that the invasion becomes politically and economically poisonous. History shows that powerful militaries often struggle most, not when they lack firepower, but when they enter environments where geography, ideology, and asymmetric tactics combine into one long war of exhaustion. That is the trap. Not immediate defeat, but strategic overextension. Now imagine the most optimistic path first, because that is usually how these decisions get sold. The United States does not announce a full occupation. Instead, it launches what officials describe as a narrow ground mission. Maybe the goal is to seize Karg Island, which Reuters reports handles around 90% of Iran's oil exports. Maybe the mission is to secure coastal points near the Strait of Hormuz to protect tanker traffic. Maybe it is a raid deep enough to reach nuclear material. On paper, this sounds controlled. Fast insertion, overwhelming force, rapid extraction. Supporters would say it is not a war of occupation. It is a strategic intervention meant to force Tehran into a weaker position. This is exactly how escalation often begins, with the belief that precision can replace duration and that a carefully designed operation can achieve political shock before the enemy adapts. But that theory only works if the enemy cooperates by collapsing, and Iran's entire modern doctrine is built around doing the opposite. If such an operation begins, the first hours may actually look successful. U.S. air power could suppress defenses. Special forces and airborne units could move quickly. Iranian fixed positions near the target could be hit hard. Washington might declare that the mission is limited, defensive, and designed to restore stability. For a brief moment, it might even appear that the gamble worked. This is the most seductive phase of every major intervention. Tactical success creates the illusion of strategic control, But then comes the question no planner can fully solve in advance. What happens after the landing? If American troops seize an island or shoreline position, they do not just become a symbol of power, they become a target. Iran can hit them with missiles, drones, swarm attacks, covert cells, and regional proxy pressure. And because the target is now American troops on or near Iranian territory, every successful strike becomes politically explosive in Washington. What was meant to be a demonstration of control can quickly become a test of endurance. This is where the story turns darker. Iran's likely response would not be symmetrical, it would be layered. Reuters reports that Iran has long prepared to use the Strait of Hormuz as a weapon, turning the world's most critical energy corridor into leverage against stronger opponents. About a fifth of global oil and liquefied natural gas normally passes through that choke point, and traffic reportedly collapsed after the war intensified. From Tehran's perspective, if it cannot stop an invasion conventionally, it can try to make the invasion too expensive for the United States and too painful for the rest of the world. That means the battlefield immediately widens. Tankers become more vulnerable. Insurance becomes unaffordable. Energy markets react first, but they do not react alone. Shipping firms, airlines, heavy industry, central banks, and governments all begin recalculating at the same time. In other words, the invasion would not remain a military event. It would become an economic event, and possibly a global one, within days. History shows that once oil becomes part of the war, public patience begins to erode fast. Reuters has already reported that prolonged disruption tied to this conflict has pushed up fuel costs, threatened inflation, and rattled industries from chemicals to airlines to technology supply chains. Analysts warned that a prolonged shock could force economies into something like a recession playbook. So if the U.S. invades Iran, the military conversation would be only one part of the story. The domestic political conversation inside America and across allied countries would change almost immediately. Families would feel the cost at the pump. Businesses would feel it in transport and energy bills. Governments already dealing with trade tensions and fragile growth would suddenly face another inflationary hit. And that is where strategic confidence begins to crack. A president may say the mission is necessary, but what happens if households start paying for the war before victory becomes visible? There is another path this could take, and it may be even more dangerous because it looks manageable at first. The United States launches a limited invasion not to occupy Iran, but to secure or extract nuclear material. Reuters reports that this option has been discussed, but also that experts consider it highly complex and risky because the material is deep underground, and any operation could pull American forces farther inside Iran for longer than intended. This is the classic nightmare of a just-enough invasion. It begins with a narrow objective that sounds urgent and rational: prevent proliferation, secure dangerous material, avoid a larger future threat. The problem is that once troops cross the threshold and the mission proves more difficult than expected, leaders face a brutal choice: pull out and look like the mission failed, or send more forces and expand the operation. That is how limited missions become campaigns, and how campaigns become wars that no one originally admitted they were starting. From a strategic perspective, the danger is not only that American troops would be inside Iran. The danger is that Iran would understand exactly what that means politically. If Washington invades for a narrow purpose, Tehran's incentive is to make that purpose harder, slower, and more humiliating to achieve. It can disperse, conceal, delay, harass, and stretch time. Time becomes a weapon. A strong military wants a short war with visible milestones. A weaker but resilient state wants uncertainty. It wants days to become weeks, and weeks to become arguments. Once that happens, the conflict stops being judged by maps and starts being judged by public endurance. Experts believe this is one of Iran's core advantages. It does not need to match American power. It needs to make the United States feel trapped between escalation and embarrassment. That is often enough to turn battlefield superiority into political vulnerability. And then there is the regional question, which may be the most explosive part of all. Reuters reports that the war has already widened across the Middle East, with Houthi attacks, fighting connected to Hezbollah, and attacks affecting Gulf states. If the U.S. invades Iran, Tehran would likely activate every available front that can pressure American interests without requiring a conventional head-on battle. This is where many viewers underestimate the scale of the risk. The conflict would no longer be a single line between Washington and Tehran. It would become a networked war. Militias could hit bases, missiles could target energy facilities, drones could threaten shipping, cyber attacks could disrupt logistics or finance. Smaller incidents would pile up, and because each one would have a different source and timing, the war would become harder to narrate and harder to control. That is exactly how major powers get pulled deeper into conflict, not through one decisive blow, but through 1,000 smaller shocks that keep demanding responses. But what happens if this goes wrong faster than expected? Imagine the United States inserts forces for a coastal or island objective, and Iran responds by hitting American personnel, expanding attacks through proxies, and tightening pressure on Hormuz at the same time. Suddenly, Washington is dealing with three crises at once: the safety of its troops, the credibility of its mission, and the stability of the global economy. That is the moment when war planning stops being about preferred options and starts being about bad options. More troops could be sent in to secure the first wave. More strikes could be launched to reduce retaliation. More regional deployments could be ordered to protect allies. Each of those choices would look rational in isolation. Together, they would mean the invasion is no longer limited. It is growing. And once the war begins growing in response to its own consequences, leaders are no longer driving events. They are chasing them. There is a third possibility, and it is the one that should worry strategists the most. The United States invades in a limited way, succeeds tactically, but fails to create a political collapse in Tehran. Iran's command system survives. Its pressure campaign survives. Its sense of existential struggle hardens. Reuters notes that Iranian planning has focused on dispersing command and using asymmetric methods to survive stronger enemies. If that system holds, then the war enters a grinding phase. No dramatic surrender. No clean end state, just a prolonged cycle of strikes, retaliation, maritime disruption, proxy activity, and economic damage. This is often the worst outcome because it creates the illusion that the war is manageable right until the accumulated cost becomes enormous. The front page may change every week, but the pressure never really goes away. The world adjusts just enough to keep moving, while the price of everything quietly rises. That is how wars stop being seen as emergencies and start becoming background conditions. And once that happens, they become harder to end because the system has begun reorganizing around them. That global dimension matters more than people realize. The World Economic Forum's 2026 risk analysis warns that geoeconomic confrontation is the top near-term global risk, and that interstate conflict remains one of the biggest threats to stability. That warning becomes far more serious if the United States invades Iran, because such an invasion would strike directly at trade routes, energy markets, and alliance politics all at once. This is not just another battlefield event. It lands in a world already strained by tariffs, supply chain redesign, polarization, and distrust. So the war would not enter a stable global system capable of absorbing one more shock. It would enter a tense global system already running low on flexibility. If A happens, then B follows. If the invasion triggers oil disruption, inflation pressure follows. If inflation pressure returns, central banks face harder choices. If growth weakens while security spending rises, governments face public anger. And if public anger rises during an unresolved war, political systems begin to shake. One of the least discussed consequences would be the effect on technology and industrial production. Reuters has reported that disruption tied to the Iran war has already raised concerns about supplies of helium for semiconductors, aluminum flows, logistics networks, and even data center resilience in parts of the region. This is where the modern world reveals its vulnerability. People often talk about geopolitics as if it is separate from the future economy. But the AI era, the cloud economy, the semiconductor race, and global industrial competition all rely on stable shipping, stable energy, stable inputs, and stable capital markets. Break enough of those at once, and even sectors that seem distant from war begin to slow down. A U.S. invasion of Iran would not just threaten oil, it could shake exactly the infrastructure that powers the next phase of economic growth. That means the war could end up colliding with the world's most sensitive supply chains at the exact moment governments are trying to secure technological advantage. Now ask the harder question. What if the invasion appears successful enough to continue, but costly enough that it cannot be politically ignored? That is when the United States faces the classic trap of partial commitment. Not enough force to finish the problem, too much force to pretend the problem is small. Reuters reports that even before any full ground invasion, U.S. casualties had already mounted, with hundreds wounded and multiple deaths associated with the wider campaign. Once American troops are visibly operating on or in Iranian territory, every casualty becomes more politically charged. Families ask why the mission expanded. Critics ask what the real objective is. Supporters demand that losses not be wasted, which often becomes an argument for doing more, not less. This is how war expands under domestic pressure. One side says pull back, another says double down, and somewhere inside that argument, the original limited mission disappears. History shows that large powers often make their biggest errors not at the moment of attack, but at the moment they confuse tactical dominance with strategic momentum. They see enemy positions collapse and assume the political system behind them is collapsing too. They mistake paralysis for surrender. They read silence as weakness. Iran is dangerous precisely because it has spent decades expecting a stronger enemy to try to decapitate its leadership and command structure early. Reuters describes a decentralized Iranian doctrine designed to absorb that shock and keep operating. If that assessment is correct, then an invasion could trigger the exact kind of war Iran has spent years preparing to endure. Not win quickly. Endure. Endure long enough that the stronger enemy begins asking whether its goals are still realistic. That is not a small distinction. In wars like this, endurance can be power. There is also the possibility that the invasion sparks fractures among U.S. partners. Some allies may support a limited mission if it looks tied to nuclear security or maritime protection. But if the operation widens, if oil shock spreads, if civilian and economic damage rises, support could become much softer. European governments already exposed to energy volatility may push for de-escalation. Asian importers watching shipping routes and manufacturing inputs may focus on stability over confrontation. Gulf states may want American protection while fearing that their own infrastructure becomes the next target. The result could be an alliance picture that looks united in statements but divided in priorities. And from Tehran's point of view, that is a victory condition of its own. If it can outlast the emotional unity of the initial invasion, it may not need to win on the battlefield to weaken the coalition around it. But there is something even more subtle that happens in long crises: normalization. The first week feels like emergency. The second week feels like intense uncertainty. By the fourth week, headlines become routine. Markets partially adapt. Political language hardens into talking points. That is the danger zone. Because once a war begins to feel normal, decision makers are more likely to take bigger risks under the illusion that the system has already absorbed the worst. Then comes the event that breaks the pattern: a major strike on a U.S. position, a mass casualty incident at sea, a wider regional attack that forces direct retaliation, a deep cyber disruption that paralyzes infrastructure, and suddenly the conflict jumps from managed danger back into open crisis. This is why analysts worry less about dramatic beginnings and more about unstable middles. The middle is where complacency meets escalation. If the U.S. were to go further than a limited operation and attempt something resembling real occupation, the consequences would become almost impossible to contain. This is the outcome experts imply when they point to troop numbers in the hundreds of thousands or even up to 1 million for total defeat. At that point, the United States would no longer be conducting a coercive intervention. It would be entering a generational war. Supply lines would matter. Rotation cycles would matter. Domestic elections would matter. Every town, road, mountain pass, and border pressure point would matter. And because Iran would likely define such a war as national survival, any remaining ambiguity about escalation would vanish. The country's entire military, ideological, and proxy ecosystem would be drawn into one prolonged struggle. From a strategic perspective, this would not be a war fought only inside Iran. It would be fought in shipping lanes, in markets, in cyber networks, in alliance meetings, and in domestic politics across multiple capitals. And yet the greatest risk may still be miscalculation, not irrationality, miscalculation. One side believes a limited invasion will compel negotiation. The other believes enduring it will force American retreat. One side thinks pain will create deterrence. The other thinks pain will create resolve. When both sides believe time is on their side, wars tend to last longer than expected. This is why so many modern conflicts become turning points only after leaders have spent months insisting they are temporary. If the United States invades Iran, both governments would immediately start trying to shape the story of time. Washington would want speed, clarity, and visible progress. Tehran would want ambiguity, endurance, and accumulating cost. That contest alone could define the next phase of the war more than any single battle. So what happens next if the US invades Iran? First, the invasion is sold as limited, necessary, and strategically clean. Then the first tactical gains create optimism. Then retaliation begins. Energy markets jump, shipping tightens, regional fronts activate, casualties become political. The mission expands just enough to protect the first mission. Then new objectives appear to justify the expansion. Then economic pain spreads far beyond the region. Then diplomacy grows louder, but harder, because every side now has more to lose by appearing weak. By that stage, the war is no longer about one operation. It is about managing a widening crisis whose costs are no longer fully under anyone's control. And that is the part most people miss. The real danger of a US invasion of Iran is not simply that it might fail militarily. The far greater danger is that it could succeed just enough to become impossible to end cleanly. Not enough to collapse the Iranian system, not enough to secure the region, not enough to restore stability, but enough to trigger all the consequences of escalation anyway, enough to produce a global oil shock, enough to widen regional attacks, enough to split political opinion, enough to drag the world deeper into a crisis nobody can stop quickly. That is what real turning points look like. They do not arrive as one obvious catastrophe. They arrive as a sequence of decisions that make the next decision more dangerous than the last. So the final question is not whether the United States can invade Iran. Of course it can. The real question is whether it can invade Iran without triggering the larger chain reaction Iran has spent years preparing to unleash. A chain reaction of disruption, retaliation, endurance, economic shock, and strategic drag. Because once that process begins, the war stops being about who crossed the border first. It becomes about who can survive the consequences longest. And if that day comes, the most unsettling possibility is not that the invasion begins badly. It is that it begins smoothly, looks controlled, and only later reveals that the real collapse was never meant to happen on the battlefield at all. It was meant to happen in the system around it. The real question is not if that risk exists. The real question is how close the world already is to finding out.